Well, good evening. Welcome to Hennepin Avenue United Methodist Church and an evening with Reverend Angela Denker. I have to believe that every evening with Angela is just a delight. So I think we're in for a good time tonight. I think since we're offering here in a church, we're going to have Pastor Christy Key come up and say an opening prayer for us. She is an associate pastor here at the church.
Good evening. Thank you for being here. Will you pray with me? Good and gracious God, we thank you for those gathered here. We thank you for Angela and for the work that you have called her to do. We thank you for the message that has been burning in her heart and is now being brought to us. We pray over this hour that your Spirit would be with us, helping us to hold in our bodies the stirring that you are leading us towards in action for justice and for peace. We most deeply desire for people to know of your goodness and not of the evils of Christian nationalism. We pray again that your Spirit would stir within us and guide us into a new age where wholeness and flourishing for all people is the truth and the justice of our day. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you. That was lovely. So my name is Jerry Gale. I'm a member of this church, and I'm the lead organizer for the Christians Against Christian Nationalism Minnesota Community Group, which is hosting us tonight. I'm going to say a few opening comments, then Angela will speak for a few minutes, and then she'll be taking questions from the audience. And then afterwards, Angela will be in the lobby signing books and giving you a chance to say hi. So let me start by saying that there is a bathroom in the back of the sanctuary in that corner back there. And next I want to welcome the people that are online. I found this hard to believe, but we had people register from Tennessee, Florida, Illinois, Missouri, Alaska, Arizona, California, Georgia, and even Wisconsin. Yeah. So I believe we've got over 50 people online right now. And I don't think I need to tell them where to find the bathroom. I'm just guessing that. But if you're joining me online and you haven't registered, there's a QR code that you can register to, let me see, get up here. One more slide. They're on the left as we look at that, there's for your online, you can register using that QR code. And then if you want to join our Facebook group, you can use the code on the left. And I'll talk a little bit about the one in the middle in a little bit. I want to say a few things about Christians Against Christian Nationalism Minnesota. Our national organization was started in 2019 by the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, which was started in 1936. Our local group had our first meeting in January 2024 in the basement of the church, and we were shocked to have over 100 attendees from several denominations at that first meeting. We were formed to improve the communication and coordination among Christians and congregations who are concerned about Christian nationalism. We are concerned about Christian nationalism because it's a threat to democracy by distorting America's promise of religious liberty for all, and distorts Christianity by taking our central message of love and service and turning it into worshiping power and white male domination. A question then we frequently get asked is, okay, so you're against Christian nationalism, what are you for? In May of last year, several people volunteered to be part of a steering team for this group. And one of our first objectives was to write a mission statement to answer that question. And the flyer that you received as you came in has that mission statement on it. And if you're online, you should be able to download that flyer and read the mission statement. I want to recognize the people that joined the steering team. They include Mike Peterson, who's a retired Lutheran pastor, and Mike will be asking the questions to Angela tonight. Nan Brown, Betsy Wirewine, Amy Hempstead, and Lynn Lucking. And Mike's here. Is Betsy back in? And Terry's down here in the front. Betsy greeted you as you came in. And, oh, there's Betsy. And so can we give them a hand too? Oh, I'm sorry I mentioned Terry Fischel has been a lot of help to us. And Ralph Olson, who is also a retired Lutheran minister, has also been a great deal of help. So I have two requests for you tonight. And the first is we could use more people on the steering team, especially if you have social media expertise or if you are from greater Minnesota. Hello to all the people out there online. If you're interested, please talk to us tonight or email us at cacnminnesota@gmail.com. I really hope I hear from several of you. And second, that middle QR code up here takes you to a GoFundMe page. And we've had this for a few months, but we haven't really been encouraging people to use it. Well, that kind of changes tonight. So we'd like to get our own Zoom account, and we'd like to host some additional speakers coming up. So if you could please make a donation, that would be wonderful to help us fight Christian nationalism. Finally, you were given a card to write down questions. If you have a question, write it down and then hold it up, and there's two ushers that will come and get those. We also have clipboards to sign up for Angela's newsletter, and they'll get sorted, passed around. And I guess that's it. Thank you for joining us tonight, and please welcome Reverend Angela Denker.
All right. Well, thank you, Jerry, and thanks everyone for coming out tonight and everyone who's online. I have a long history with this congregation, and my dad reminded me of it this evening, too. I, as a little child growing up, used to come here for the live animal Christmas pageants that used to be held here. Yes, all right. So this church has long been on the forefront of doing innovative things. And the next time that I was at this church was, and Jerry, you'll have to remind me, when we were here for one of those first events. So it was 2 years ago. I was thinking it was maybe even 3 years ago. But I have to tell you all sort of the backstory behind that. Someone who I had known as a journalist for a long time, Guthrie Graves Fitzsimmons, at the time he was an organizer for the national body in Washington, D.C. of Christians Against Christian Nationalism. And he kept kind of saying, you know, I met this guy from Minnesota named Jerry Gale. And he keeps wanting to get something going in Minnesota, and I don't know what to tell him because we're just starting out and I don't really have anything, but he wants to get something going. And so just through sheer force of will, I think, at that point, because again, this was June 2024, 2023, okay, yeah, thank you. So it was a little bit longer ago. Yeah, June 2023, we had no idea Trump would be elected again at that time. And so there wasn't, we're always still fighting, right, to get people to recognize the danger of this movement and the relevancy of this movement. And at that time, I don't think there were any state chapters of Christians Against Christian Nationalism, but really through sheer force of will, Jerry got Guthrie to come here, and we did an event up in the art room, I think here, the room with all the artwork. We had a huge turnout, a great crowd, and it was the first time I think I met Jerry. And it's really encouraging to see the ways that this Minnesota chapter of Christians Against Christian Nationalism has really led the way. You know, I think that when they first started the nationwide movement, they thought, well, maybe we'll have a local chapter in a place like Texas, maybe a place like North Carolina. And it's really impressive to see the ways that Minnesota has stepped up. Minnesota has continued to be asked and called upon to be courageous and brave. And I think also as a faith leader in Minnesota, I've seen that Minnesota has been called upon to offer an alternative vision of Christianity than the vision of Christianity that is often broadcast by the national media, and certainly represented by white evangelicalism, and certainly represented by the MAGA movement, and the way that it understands Jesus as a violent force, a militant force, and certainly a masculine force in the way of traditional violent masculinity that I write about in Disciples of White Jesus. So typically when I speak, I'll usually speak for about an hour. Tonight I have about 10 minutes, so let's whip through it quickly here. And then we're going to get to some discussion, which is great. Pastor Christy and I were talking this evening before just about, it feels like there's sort of a heaviness that has settled upon some of us in Minnesota in the aftermath of this promise from ICE that they'll pull out. And we all know that many of the words spoken by leadership in this administration aren't worth the paper that they're printed on. But still, I think there's always this sense of hopefulness that things are going to get better, and that there's going to be a relief from this sort of barrage of violence, a barrage of lies. And in Minnesota, I want to recognize, too, that prior to the January Metro surge, we, very close to my home in Minneapolis and touched our family personally, we had the Annunciation school shooting. And prior to that, which I know touched many of you personally, we had the assassinations of Melissa and Mark Hortman and the attempted assassinations of many other lawmakers, including John Hoffman and Yvette Hoffman. And so there's been a great deal of trauma. And there's been a great deal of, okay, gear up, we're gonna get up, we're gonna be positive again, we're gonna hope again. And there's a sense, sometimes a feeling of hopes being dashed. And these moments of celebration or joy quickly replaced by moments of grief or pain. And many of us, if we were raised in white Christianity, we weren't necessarily raised with that sense of resilience. We were kind of raised instead with this sense that, well, we were God's chosen people and we were always going to be on the side of things working out well, and we were always going to be in the side of the majority power. And so often I think we as white Christians need to look towards that witness of the Black church for that resiliency, for that reminder that we worship a God who was crucified. So I wanted to share a quick psalm with you tonight to tap into the feelings I think that many are experiencing in this moment. And I'll say also, I experienced some of these feelings last week. My family and I went up north for a couple days while the kids were out of school. And I was maybe surprised by the intensity of feeling that I still had, even watching and noticing the Charlie Kirk signs still along the side of the highway, or still seeing some of the Trump signs even these more than a year after the election. So this is Psalm 13, and it represents a Christianity, and not even a Christianity, right? The Psalms are also Holy Scripture for Jewish folks as well. But it represents a longing and a faithfulness in a God who is present in the midst of destruction and violence, and a God who bears witness to pain and to death. So Psalm 13 says, "How long, O Lord? Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I bear pain in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all day long? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep the sleep of death. And my enemy will say, I have prevailed. My foes will rejoice because I am shaken. But I trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me." The word of the Lord. Some of you wanted to say thanks be to God. Before we move into our time of question and answer, I want to leave you with just a couple of tools, and if you've heard me speak before, you've probably heard these before, but I always want to give them because I think it's important to have quick go-to tools, I want to give you these to have in your back pocket when you find yourself in those difficult conversations with loved ones, with family members. You find yourself in those moments where it seems like the mantle of Jesus and Christianity has been claimed for violence and for power and for amassing wealth and influence over and against others. And so the two things I want to give you first, I'm not going to read it tonight, but I want to turn your attention to John 18, 33 through 38. This is a passage that includes a conversation between Jesus and Pontius Pilate. I've used this passage to teach on the rhetoric of Christian nationalism because you see in Pontius Pilate the way that he argues with Jesus is very representative of much of the political rhetoric that you hear on the right today. It's grounded in gaslighting, it's grounded in making people question their own reality, and it's grounded in mistaking falsehoods for truth. And so you see that in Pilate's words, and then you see in contrast in Jesus' words, a very straightforward witness grounded in the existence of truth. And so this is a helpful text. I've even used this text with secularist groups because it's not about necessarily the article of faith in this text, but it's about using this text to understand the rhetoric and the arguments of Christian nationalism. So again, that's John 18, 33 through 38. And then the last thing I'll do is I want to share with you a definition of Christian nationalism. I'm so grateful that we have this community now of scholars and researchers and faith leaders who are studying Christian nationalism. We all come at it from a slightly different perspective. There's historians, there's sociologists, there's journalists. My perspective specifically comes both from a pastoral lens as a parish pastor, a church pastor who's served a number of conservative congregations, and also as a Lutheran myself and a Lutheran theologian. I was speaking today with a journalist and someone of a Lutheran background from Germany. And he has a long history of studying Dietrich Bonhoeffer and understanding the rise of Nazism in Germany. But he told me the reason he wanted to speak with me today is he said, in Germany, we're so inspired by Minneapolis and by Minnesota. And we want to look to you to see what kind of language do we need to use, how do we need to speak to draw people into our movement the way that you have with this language about neighbors and neighborism. And I told him, we're so glad that you're inspired by us, and also we're feeling the heaviness of this moment here. And so it helps to know that there are others around the globe working in this moment. But my definition of Christian nationalism is really shaped by that heritage and also by that warning of, I'm of German heritage, that warning of the German churches, the majority of whom signed oaths of allegiance to Hitler and to the German Christian church. And notice again, that church defined itself by its nationality, not by its adherence to Scripture. So real quickly, Christian nationalism is a version of the idolatrous theology of glory, which replaces the genuine worship of God with worship of a particular vision of America, often rooted in a revisionist history of white people in the 1950s, before the civil rights movement or the women's movement. I'll say here too, that idol is shifting. The idol has gone from being a nationalist, looking back sort of Norman Rockwell vision of America, to the idol has come more strongly to focus both on Donald Trump himself, the idol of the Christian nationalist movement, but it's also come to focus on a particular vision of masculinity. So you see me unpack that in Disciples of White Jesus, but you also see it in figures like Pete Hegseth, like Pastor Doug Wilson, who recently addressed the worship service at the Pentagon. I recommend reading Word and Ways reporting on that to see the depths to which this idol has become highly gendered, and it's become really rooted in this particular vision of masculinity itself, something that's deeply damaging, not just for women and girls, but for men and boys as well. Christian nationalism supports a violent takeover of government and the imposition of fundamentalist Christian beliefs on all people. I want to emphasize the fundamentalism part more than the conservative part. This is a movement that is much more fundamentalist than it is conservative. Christian nationalism relies on a theological argument that equates American military sacrifice. Notice again this focus on the military, and as someone who comes from a family of veterans, that's very important to me. The ways that the military is being warped under this movement. It equates American military sacrifice with Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. It suggests that Christians are entitled to wealth and power, in contrast to Jesus' theology of the cross, which reminds Christians that they too have to carry their cross, just as our crucified Savior did. Well, let's move into some time of conversation. And if you want that full definition, I do have it on my Substack. So if you go on there, if you go onto any of the news posts, you can find it in bold on there if you didn't get the whole thing.
So how are you?
Oh boy. Well, I don't know. We last saw each other in January, right?
Yeah.
I think, was it the week after Alex Preddy was killed?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mike and I were together for a gathering of pastors in Stillwater, Lutheran pastors from the St. Paul Synod, and we all came together and we had this chant. I mean, I think there was teaching and learning that day, but it was really just being together that day that was really important too.
It's always important.
Yeah.
So I have a list of questions that I think were generated by the online book club thing on the 10th.
Awesome.
And I'm going to skip around a little bit. This one says, I've withdrawn from social media because it makes me feel angry and manipulated. I don't want to look at what Trump is posting or DHS or Homeland Security. However, being informed is necessary to counter misinformation and disinformation. How do you balance paying attention to social media with protecting yourself from becoming overwhelmed by it? Thank you for Psalm 13.
Yeah. I looked that one up tonight because I felt that. How long, O Lord? Well, this is a great question. And if you all are willing, maybe just a show of hands or if you're inside your head, but who's feeling this challenge right now, this challenge between social media, information, but also, almost everybody, right? And if you're a parent of kids, my kids are 13 and 10, you're also feeling that challenge with your kids. And my 10-year-old has an iPad, and recently they've started to have chat groups with at least it's real life friends in school.
Sure.
But nonetheless, it's a new challenge. So I think that the first way to approach this is just to acknowledge that both parts of that statement are true, and both parts are things that you have to attentively manage. You have to manage your own well-being when it comes to your online news diet and what you're consuming, much like we're managing our food diet and what we're consuming. It's like that with news as well. And so you have to be a mindful consumer. And that's not possible all the time. I think we all get into those doom loops where you're just kind of mindlessly scrolling, and these social media companies know that the way that they profit most is when people are the most angry and outraged. And there's a reason then why a lot of these algorithms skew people to the right, because that's the content that is feeding them the most anger and outrage. It's not an equivalent method between the left and the right news. But so the first thing is to just be mindful as you're consuming, to take breaks, to step away, and to think about, does what I just read make sense? Google is still, if you can ignore the AI summaries and look past the AI summaries, Google is still a helpful tool to look at the sources. So if you want to look up an author of something that you're reading, or if you want to look up a source, that's a helpful thing to do, to just get a reality check. Because as a journalist, I know we live in a very different media landscape. Even when I first started journalism school back in 2003, it's a very, very different media landscape. And there's not a shared sense of trust or a shared sense of that these are trustworthy outlets anymore. So you really have to do your own investigation. My own wrestling for me has been, I also think, you should not be active on every single platform. So everybody kind of has to figure out what are the platforms that work for me. None of them are perfect. Most of them are run by immoral people and owned by people that do not care what kind of information pours out of their platform. So just being wary and cynical about that is helpful. I have really appreciated Substack as a place where I can share uncensored columns and information about what's going on, specifically around Christian nationalism, and connect with other scholars who are also on Substack: Diana Butler-Bass, Robert P. Jones, Kristen Dumais, Jamar Tisby, all people who have enriched their work through Substack. And at the same time, Substack hosts neo-Nazi newsletters. So those of us who are on Substack are constantly having to wrestle with how do we use this platform and not let it use us, and also be mindful of there may be a time when it's time to go. I mentioned earlier Guthrie Graves Fitzsimmons, who was one of the initial leaders of the National Christians Against Christian Nationalism movement. I think I first met Guthrie through Twitter back years ago, when it used to really be a little bit more of a news site. So I mentioned that to say things change with platforms too, and you have to be willing to change with the platform, because when Elon Musk bought Twitter, it changed dramatically. And it especially changed for women journalists on Twitter. And it became a place that just fomented a great deal of harassment in a way that was unparalleled on any other site. So when I was going through my own journey of censorship with the Star Tribune and leaving the Star Tribune in the wake of Charlie Kirk's killing, I encountered a massive amount of harassment on Twitter, fomented locally by Liz Collin of Alpha News. And so at that point, when I was starting to see this harassment become local, that brings it to a different place. And at that point, I knew, even though I've got all these followers and I've met these people and I've met academics and it's been a source of encouragement, I have to, at this point, leave Twitter. And so I did that last fall, and I will tell you, since then, I've seen a dramatic decrease in harassment that I've received, to the point where when I was on Twitter, I couldn't advertise any of my speaking events for fear of harassment. And since I've left there, I can, again, advertise them. So I would warn specifically about engagement on X and on Twitter. Facebook, Instagram are sort of in this medial space. You have to be, I think, very careful with how you engage on there, because Mark Zuckerberg has done a lot of cooperating both with ICE, with the Trump administration, with right-wing causes. But I also have seen, and I see with Christians Against Christian Nationalism as well, Facebook has actually been a fruitful place for organizing and for resistance. So as much as, I was one of the original Facebook people when I was in college, and we had our college name in parentheses. Some of us elder millennials relate to that. As much as people think, oh, Facebook is the worst, it's actually also been a fruitful place for organizing. So each of these, again, moderate your own use of platforms. Be liberal with the block or the unfollow button. If you have a family member who's just posting a lot of inflammatory things, you're not going to unfriend, for instance, not that this is a real life example, your mother-in-law. But you can unfollow, and you can just curate what you're seeing, not because This is not saying, oh, I only want to get certain kinds of information, but it is a way of preserving health, and also it can be a way of preserving relationships. And then if somebody is really harassing you, that is what the block button is for. Just you become very adept at seeing, okay, this is going to spin into harassment. And I think for women and for people of color, for LGBTQ people especially, there's a quick turn where you start to see this is where it's going to turn into that, and you have to be quick to shut that down before you start getting some really violent images or some dangerous images.
Do you also think it might help to have a real-life friend who knows you pretty well to say, Angela, I think you can, help you monitor those things, because sometimes we can't do that ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's, and also, and this is for parents too, like cultivating those real life conversations and those real life relationships is really important. And that is where too, local faith groups can come in as a place where those real life connections can happen. And I often say at events like this, I mean, just look around and see you're surrounded by a lot of people who want to work against this movement and who want to partner with you. And I see particularly pastors. I see pastors get caught up into these loops of trying to make everybody happy. And so they spend all their time with the most disgruntled, angry people. And they end up then neglecting the people that really want to work together and do good things because they're so I would also advise, when you're engaging in social media, especially activism work or truth-telling work, to turn off that piece of you that says you have to please everybody and that everybody's got to be happy with you. But that is a skill learned in ministry.
Self-care, yes. Next question. Even though at the end of your book, I know you tell us that if we're looking for easy answers, we might be disappointed. The book was not at all disappointing, just so you know.
Thank you.
But the question here is, how do we teach boys to care about others as much or more than they care about themselves?
I really think my pastor answer to that is, and you see it throughout the book too, we have this really beautiful example of Jesus as a vision of masculinity that is rooted in empathy, that is rooted in kindness and care and willingness to show grief and sadness. And so I think leaning into that real life example and reclaiming who Jesus is, his friendships with women, his witness to over and over again proclaiming the needs and the primacy of the poor, that is a huge place. But I also think it's people like you, Mike. It's people like men in this room. I think that there's this sense that I hear sometimes from men, from dads, from uncles, coaches, teachers, pastors, brothers, who say, well, I don't know what I have to contribute to this conversation because I wasn't raised in this hardcore masculine culture, and I don't identify like that, so I don't know what I have to offer. And it's in those very moments that you do have something really powerful to offer to the young boys and young men in your life, which is, for some of you, you've made it to a senior age being a man who has care and empathy, and a man who has values that are not just about trying to prove you're the strongest person in the room. I mean, I don't know if anyone caught recently, it's kind of been making the rounds on the internet, RFK and Kid Rock in the sauna. Yeah. And RFK's wearing jeans, I think, in the hot tub. There's this desperation to be cool or to be strong or to be masculine. And the veneer of desperation is so thin. And the reality of masculine strength that I've seen throughout my life, I've seen it in my husband, I've seen it in my dad and my brother, in the men in my life, and pastors who I've worked with, it is so much more real and authentic than that kind of purported strength. And that kind of purported strength, that's why it's so fragile. That's why it can't take any criticism, it can't take any threat. So really for men who do not subscribe to the Pete Hegseth School of Strength, to lean into your own identity and what it means for you to be a man. I mean, I think we've seen this in Minneapolis and Minnesota recently. A neighbor of mine recently wrote a piece for the New York Times about being a resistance driver and how it can be fun. And he talked about just his role as a dad of picking up people from school, picking up kids, taking them around. And that lightness of masculinity as being a part of these movements without having to be the leader of the movement is really a powerful thing.
If you have any questions written on cards, please hold your hand up and somebody will pick up the card. So, because you're touching upon answering all of these questions, but so some of this may sound repetitious. One of the questions concerns the declining attendance at churches generally. So what are alternative experiences that are available for boys and girls to help them find their path outside of violent narratives that are shown widely on the internet? And I would include video games in that.
Well, one of the encouraging places where I see this, and I think we're going to watch this play out probably even tomorrow with the U.S. men's and women's hockey teams. Because one of the encouraging places that I've seen as a former sports writer, I've seen, and I see it in my boys as well, and in high school athletes, this willingness of male athletes and this engagement by male athletes in women's athletics, and wanting to go to the girls' basketball games, and wanting, seeing NBA players going to the WNBA games. And there's been more of this partnership. And the reason I say we're going to see how it plays out tomorrow is anytime you start to have this burgeoning social movements of acceptance and support, and so athletics is just an example of how we can see that support. It can also happen in the workplace with support and mentorship between men and women in fields that are either traditionally masculine, maybe like engineering, or fields like that are traditionally feminine, such as nursing, when we have more partnership and mentorship between underrepresented groups in those fields that can help. But in sports, so we just had, rah-rah, America win both of the hockey championships, men's and women's, in the Olympics. And one of the discouraging parts to come out of that is when Donald Trump was speaking with the men's hockey team. I started my sports career as a hockey reporter, so I have a lot of information on hockey locker rooms and how those things go. But one of the things he said to the men's team is, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm going to also have to invite the women's team. I think they would impeach me if I didn't." And, as it was shown in the video or the audio, the men's hockey team players really laughed along with that. I think where we're going to maybe see this play out in the next few days is we'll see if any of those men on the hockey team push back against that. Because prior to that conversation, they'd been supporting their women colleagues on the women's hockey team. They'd been supporting the U.S. women's hockey team. There'd been a lot of collegiality. And here in Minnesota, we have a long, proud history of women's hockey as well as men's hockey. So it's going to be interesting to see that play out. But I do think athletes have a unique opportunity and role to play in this whole conversation, just as we saw with the Super Bowl, with Bad Bunny's Super Bowl performance at halftime. So the arts, music, athletics, all places where we can continue to see that kind of alternative engagement and support.
Ooh, more cards. Back to the sports thing. I'm a big football fan, and there's been a little bit of conversation. I'd like there to be more conversation about, the Colin Kaepernick effect. How can all of that money and all that influence help us be a better country. I'd like to see that.
There's one of the first ways that led to the publication of my first book, Red State Christians, was my coverage of Colin Kaepernick's kneeling protests, and I wrote a piece for the Washington Post about how those protests really represented this history of Christian protests in America through the black church, and that Colin Kaepernick, when he was doing those protests, was taking on that same mantle of peaceful protest, of nonviolence, and the ways that when black people and black athletes engage in nonviolent protest, it is depicted as violent, simply because of who is doing it. And I will mention again, I think a really important area for activism for Christians here in Minnesota is support of those who were arrested. All of them except for one or two people were black. Those who were arrested for protesting at the city's church in St. Paul, where one of the pastors, David Easterwood, is the leader of ICE. And again, this is, I think, another example of the race of the protesters impacting this protest being seen as violent, because it certainly wasn't. And even instead, the way that they were treated in their arrest, in being forced to spend a night in jail, they were treated with violence. So certainly, we haven't talked a lot about race, but it's always a part of the conversation, is certainly within Christian nationalism.
Okay, this fresh question just in. Responding to the question about teaching boys to care about people and others than themselves, how do we teach grown men to care? Is it too late? And I'll close my ears for this one.
No, I thought the question was going to say, how do we teach girls? Because then I was going to talk about the trad wife movement and all that. But no, it's never too late, right? I mean, Jesus certainly teaches us that. But I do think there's a place for discernment too. And, again, one of the places where I see people, especially faith leaders or activists, reach burnout is when they're pouring a lot of time and energy into people who are just not interested. So maybe for some people, they're not at a point where they can open their heart with empathy to think about a different way or to think about caring. And that's really sad, because one of the main points that I often raise, I just preached last Ash Wednesday, and one of the things I mentioned in that sermon was a tweet from Elon Musk where he said, whoever said that money doesn't buy happiness was certainly right. And then he had a sad face emoji. And he posted this tweet on the very day that his personal wealth skyrocketed by around $800 billion. And so I think what you see is that the end game for a faith tradition, for a political tradition that preaches that empathy is toxic, that our only way to relate to each other is through competition and through getting one over against each other, even those folks who seem to have risen to the very top of that, it leads them to heartache and disaster and despair. So there's a lot of grief and lament for those places, and certainly I think it's important to recognize people who are caught in that spiral, as Martin Luther King Jr. called it, a descending spiral of violence, to recognize where people are in that spiral and to note. But I think for men, there's a great group called White Men for Racial Justice that meets out of the Twin Cities here. There's a national group, but there's a local group that meets in person. I've heard from a lot of men locally, guys in their 30s, 40s, 50s, that's been a really neat place for them to engage and to work with others. And it's like this opportunity to say, this isn't about saying how awful we are. It's about working together to build something better for our sons, for our daughters, for our communities.
Here's one that'll keep you going. Can you talk about the connection between Christian nationalism in the 21st century and the Southern strategy in the 20th century?
yes, and folks should certainly look to historians like Robert P. Jones or Kristen Dumais, because they really break this down. And actually, Randall Balmer is another, I think he's a historian, but he's an academic who's studying the rise of Christian nationalism. And he was one of the first to identify that this embrace of anti-abortion movement by the Christian right was also an extension of these racialized politics and the ways that this anti-abortion movement, and I know many people caught within that movement there is genuine concern for babies, for mothers, but those leading the movement, it's often a very cynical ploy to continue these politics of superiority and white supremacy. So you continue to see these same folks popping up again and again. Sometimes it feels like whack-a-mole, because we had the civil rights movement, we broke it down. We had these social movements, the women's movement, we've had the gay rights movement, and the same ideas keep popping up in new form. It's these same ideas repackaged to say that some people are more human than others. So it's important to realize this is all part of the same strategy, and also important to just name it. This church, City's Church, that employs an ICE agent as one of its pastors, is part of the Southern Baptist Convention. Now, why is there a Southern Baptist Convention and not just a General Baptist Convention? Because of slavery. The Southern Baptist Convention was founded to support slavery. And the founding ideals of a group are hard to shake. And so that's why again and again and again you see Southern Baptist leadership. And again, I have good friends who are Southern Baptists. I know people who are pastor in Southern Baptist churches. I'm not demonizing an entire group, but I'm saying the leadership of that group is still rooted in these foundational ideals that say that some people are less human than others. And so anytime you have a group, complementarianism, that's saying women and men are inherently different, have your antenna go up a little bit, because the basic idea and founding principle of all of these groups is that some people are more human than others.
When I first read that question, I thought of the lost cause.
Yeah.
It keeps popping up again and again and again.
Well, that's why it's Make America Great Again. It's not Make America Great, it's Make America Great Again. It's a past to backwards looking movement that seeks, like the lost cause, to resurrect that.
Okay, anti-Christian nationalism. How are transracial marriages affected by policy? This says my daughter's interested in marrying an Asian Indian. They are a wonderful couple. What are they facing policy-wise? And I'll tell you personally, our daughter is married to a Korean, and our granddaughter is the cutest little thing you've ever seen. Not that I'm prejudiced at all. I'm strictly objective.
And we forget how recent these, and how many people fought and were put in prison and were even killed to get to a place in the U.S. where now we have acceptance, again, it's tenuous, but of multiracial marriages, that it's still relatively new within this century. So I think, and it's really interesting too, so there's a pastor in Texas who is really championing many of these ideas about white Christian nationalism, about white supremacy, and he is on record of sort of railing against biracial, multiracial marriages as quote unquote not the ideal. Now what's interesting is he himself is married to a person who is not white. And
It's like J.D. Vance.
Yes. And so, I have a lot of empathy for feeling, how is his wife internalizing that message? How are his children internalizing that message? But so I do think it's like a twofold answer. It's, on one hand, we live in a country where there are increasing numbers all the time of multiracial marriages, and as you say, biracial, multiracial kids, and it is a beautiful thing that some of us get to have in our own families, in our relationships, in our social networks. And by sheer number, that's going to be really hard to roll back, because as we've seen with gay marriage as well, when people have relationships in their lives with people from marginalized groups, it breeds a sense of acceptance and familiarity that's really hard to turn back. So I think that on one hand, we need to say, we do live in a country where this is now an entrenched part of what it means to be an American, and also at the same time being aware that there are many politicians on the right. Again, we have Marco Rubio, who's a Cuban American, giving a speech about white supremacy and claiming that his relatives all come from Spain and Italy and not from Latin America. So it gets really murky and complicated, because sometimes white supremacy is being espoused by people who would not be characterized as white. And so it's very difficult, it's very sad, and it's also a reality on the right now that yes, there are attacks on women voting, there are attacks on multiracial marriages, but at the same time, we also need to look back at American history and see the battles that have been fought and won to entrench these rights and how commonplace they've become. And so be ready to defend these rights and to see that they are an integral part of what it means to be an American today.
Thank you. There's two more questions, and one of them is what are Christian nationalism, what are Christians Against Christian Nationalism groups doing specifically to counter the Christian nationalist movement? And I would refer them to online sites, because that's, and you don't work for them. So here's a good question to end up with, probably. Okay, I'll bite. Please talk about trad wives.
Okay,
I did.
And first I'll say too, yes, there's a lot happening with specifically this local chapter of Christians Against Christian Nationalism. So I do urge you to sign up, go to the website online. You can be a part of the newsletter. They are going to be bringing in more speakers, more events, more opportunities to engage. And there's some great partnerships that Christians Against Christian Nationalism has with different groups around supporting religious freedom, groups like Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, that has been very successful in waging legal battles against Christian nationalist legislation in a number of different states. The Minnesota legislature has a caucus as well that is devoted to religious freedom. And one of those members, I believe, is John Marty, and he's, prominent Lutheran family, and also... Oh, good. Yeah, tell him I mentioned him. Yes, he's been a wonderful, wonderful champion for religious freedom, and for so we have a lot of allies here locally, and there's a lot of organizations, so it's really important to get plugged in. So, oh boy, the trad wife movement. Okay. Well, I'll just say it's almost like the flip side of a lot of the things that I'm talking about in Disciples of White Jesus. And it's really, there's an aesthetic piece to it that's really important not to miss. So when you see this masculinity movement, the number one plastic surgery procedure for men in Washington, D.C. Recently has been chin implants, because there's this desire for an aesthetic appearance that looks somehow traditionally strong or masculine. For women, it's the flip side. And you see this with women who are close in Trump's orbit, that they're required to look a very particular way, a particular gendered feminine look, whether it's breast augmentation, whether it's false eyelashes, whether it's hair extensions. There's a very particular look that's really expensive and sometimes dangerous for women to continue to engage in all the time. It can be aging for women who are young. So that's one piece of that can be unexpected, because when you think of a trad wife movement, it stands for traditional wife. Traditional wife we don't often think of as coupled with plastic surgery. But I do claim a particular, expertise in these because of my years spent as a pastor in Orange County, California. and surrounded by evangelical church movements there. The other piece to this trad wife movement, and I would direct you also to the work of Sarah Stankorb. She wrote a book called Disobedient Women. She's been one of the first chroniclers of survivors of the trad wife movement, women who were in marriages where they were told they could not work, where they were spanked by their husbands for perceived disobedience. And it's important to note the parallels here between fundamentalisms. You know, American Christians often think we have nothing in common with Islamic fundamentalist groups like Al-Qaeda or like ISIS. But in reality, the commonality is how women are treated within these groups. That women are required to be extremely separate from men, that women are required to dress a certain way. There are annals of conversation online about the evils of women's leggings in these groups. And some of these men who have made their careers on writing about the evils of leggings are now in very prominent positions of power in American government, which is a little scary to think about. But this trad wife movement it's appealing to younger women who have seen women around my age and older. They've seen us lean into the boss babe era of women can do it all, women can have it all, you can be successful in your career, you can be a mother, you can be a wife, you can do it all, you can bring home this big salary, but you can also clean the house and do the laundry and make the meals. And they've seen women in our 40s, women in 50s, 60s be exhausted by that. And they've seen the failure of that story that we've told to women, not because the women's rights movement, not because feminism has failed, but because we never in America provided the social safety net that women needed for feminism to succeed. We have not provided child care assistance. We've not provided equal paying jobs. Women face a penalty when we have children, whereas men who have children get a benefit. But younger women see the exhaustion and the burnout and the disappointment of older women, and they become susceptible to these sort of gauzy, beautiful, Instagram reels of women with long blonde hair and sort of milkmaid dresses living on a farm saying, you don't have to go to college, you just marry a rich guy and have children and you can make cereal from scratch. And it's very packaged. Joe Piazza is another person who really writes about the influencer element of this. Now, of course, like somebody like Phyllis Schlafly, or like these women, like Kristi Noem, women who are in positions of power in movements that say women should not have power, it's always for thee, the rules are for thee, but not for me, right? And so even these women who are online pretending, well, I'm not gonna work, they're in reality making a lot of money telling other women to not make money. So there's always an economic component, always follow the money, also really pay attention to the aesthetics. And Kristen Dumais does have a new book coming out on sort of this feminine side of the Christian nationalist movement, but if there's room and space, maybe I'll work on that too. I'll see. Thanks.
I wasn't told to give closing remarks, but I just want to say that for me personally, reading this book, I think you have a real gift. I see the pastor and the journalist coming out when you go into people's lives and highlight their lives and bring it out. I think you help bring meaning to what they're doing, and I really appreciate that, so thank you. And thank you for this evening.
Thank you.
Would you please put your hands together? And my understanding is that they can still talk to you as they are purchasing a book.
Yes, they don't have to purchase a book. Just talk to me.
Oh, come on.
I do have both Red State Christians and Disciples of White Jesus, a few copies out there on a table. They're $25. I can take cash, check, or Venmo, and you can sign up for Substack and stay in touch that way. But really nice to see everyone here tonight. Thank you to Jerry and to Christians Against Christian Nationalism for all the work that they're doing here in Minnesota. It's really inspiring. And thank you to Hennepin Avenue United Methodist Church for all that they do to be a place for these kinds of conversations and these kind of movements. And I'm excited to see what more you do next. Thank you.
Thank you.